I made a really bonehead move that facilitated me removing my engine. So I'm going to talk to you about how easy it is to get an engine in and out of an early Porsche 911. This is a 1966 car. And I'm going to talk to you about my bonehead move that caused this engine removal to happen. Removing an early Porsche 911 engine, and that includes cars all the way up through the 80s, is a fairly easy process, even with simple tools and just jack stands in your garage. You don't need a lift. The engines aren't that heavy, and you can lower them out from below. So first you start by putting the car up on jack stands. I use the location underneath here where the torsion bar comes out to hold the jack stands up. And then you're going to disconnect all your wiring and then disconnect the rear engine mounts and start lowering the engine, and then you can disconnect the 4 bolts to the transmission and it'll slide out backwards. Usually you have to remove the bumper if you don't get it high enough. If you can get it high enough with jack stands, you can do it without removing the bumper. So it's not a terribly complicated process, and it can be done by yourself. Now, I just use a regular jack to put that underneath the sump plate of the engine and support the engine, undo those mounts, and then lower it out. I forgot to mention the 2 oil lines you have to disconnect from your oil tank. Now I'm going to show you my bonehead reason for having to remove the engine. So this flywheel is what came out. You'll notice that the teeth over here are chewed almost completely off. Well, I used a remote starter because I was going to work on the ignition, do some timing stuff, and I had the car in gear and the emergency brake on. And I used the remote starter and it went grrr. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then I did it again, and then I heard something snap. And stupidly, I pushed the button a couple of times, and then I turned the engine a little bit after I had released the emergency brake and taken it out of gear, and it cranked over once, and it stopped when the starter got to here. So this flywheel was damaged already. It already had chew places in the teeth that were really messed up, but it was still working. And I knew this when I put the engine back together last time, but I figured it could last a while longer, and it did. But fortunately I have a spare, and I will put that back in the car. But important safety tip: don't crank your car with it in gear and the emergency brake on. In most cases it probably won't hurt anything, but in this case, having already had damaged teeth, it ruined my flywheel. I use 2 4x4 blocks on either side of the engine underneath the heat exchangers to rest it when I'm after I've moved it, and while I'm moving it, I move forward and backward, so if I happen to lose balance of the engine, they'll just set down on top of that. They give me just about the right amount of height to have a little clearance with my jack and be able to see underneath and move the engine around fairly safely without being too far off the ground. As with all restoration and car work projects, clean, clean, clean. Cleaning is going to be half the time you spend on the job. So I'm going to clean these up, and then I'm going to swap over the bolts and the bearing into this flywheel. Sometimes you don't have the exact right tool for the job. I need to pull the bearing out of this center of the flywheel. So I'm going to use a ball joint tool. Put it on this side. Put a washer and a nut here. And tighten it down, and it should pull it right on out. Okay, flywheel bolts installed, torque to 110 foot-pounds, and tightening those things down with this little star tool. Man, it's hard to do. You got to push it in while torquing, and that's how I ended up with my Baby Yoda bandage here. Because as I was torquing, I came down and gouged my thumb on my heat exchanger. So I was wearing gloves too. So hazards of the job. So when it's time to put your clutch disc back in, I like to make sure there's no glaze left on the flywheel and on the pressure plate. So I take this is 120 grit sandpaper and just yeah, I can feel it's not quite perfectly smooth anymore, and that's a good thing. We want the clutch disc to bed into it. Now we'll take pressure plate and do the same. All right, and you can really see the swirl pattern that I've put into there. And once you start engaging the clutch, it'll grab onto the clutch nicer that way. All right, pro tips for installing your 911 engine back into your car by yourself. First, make sure you remove your spline tool, because it will actually mate up with a real spline. And make sure your transmission is in neutral so it can spin easily, and then it will actually sort of twist itself onto the spline when you push on it. Other thing is flywheel lock. We have to remove the flywheel lock. It won't go in with the flywheel lock on. Okay, and now what we're going to do is these studs that stick out here are going to slide into the holes at the bottom of the transmission here and there. So what we'll do is we'll inch the engine forward, lift it up to the right place, and then get those two studs to slide into those two holes, and the spline should just line up pretty well and slide forward. Then we can bolt back up our starter, put a bolt through this one, and it's mated back up. And then we'll raise it up to put it into the engine mount. All right, I got the two studs into the transmission, and now it's a matter of sort of working it forward until the spline lines up and gets into the clutch disc from the transmission. Oh, I think it just went. Let's see. I would say it's in there. All right. Take the starter bolt, slide that in there. All right. Try the other one. Okay, that one goes in. Having a wobble nut is real nice. The nut is right behind the end of the clutch cable. almost done. Then I gotta put the nut on. Okay, I'll come back and torque that down later. Now, got to get over to the other side. Okay, I'm over to the other side, and a little easier to get to this one. Ooh, I just felt the engine move a little bit when I pulled on it. It's a little unnerving when you're halfway under the engine, but it's held up by the jack stands and these 4x4 blocks, so if it fell, hopefully it wouldn't kill me. Hopefully. And then there's a nut on the starter up here too that I've got to get to. Probably can't see that very well, but I need to get that one on, and then it is mated up. Here's a little tip for your throttle linkage. This rod that goes down to the transmission, you can put a bolt on here so it doesn't fall down and slide out of the keyhole, and then it will stay on even if this thing pops off up here and starts to slide down. You won't lose the rod. It's a very simple, 5 or 6 millimeter bolt. Just holds it in place. Works nicely. I'm not sure how visible this is going to be in this lighting, but I've removed my front oil cooler thermostat so that I could get to the lines. There's the one going one way and here's the one going the other. I've got a bag. You can see I have used compressed air to push oil through and catch it because I want to replace the oil even in the cooler if possible. So I am going to do it this way, and hopefully, let's see if you can see any of the oil coming out. Whoop, you hear that? Blip, 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 coming out. All right. Well, so anyway, that'll make me feel a little bit better about replacing all of the oil. It's pretty dark. And there's the oil bag. Got all the wiring hooked up. I've got my oil lines back in place from draining out the front oil cooler. Now the fuel lines have to be hooked back up, or else, you know, it'll squirt fuel everywhere. We'll have to turn on a fuel pump. We don't want that. And then this side. snugged up. Now I'm going to fill it with oil. All right, before you go cranking it up, you want to check all the sensor wires. This, I just realized, was not hooked up. It's the pressure sender, I think. And this over here was not hooked up, which is the temperature, oil temperature. And you got to make sure your points wires, which I have a completely pointless ignition over here with 2 wires that go, one to power and one to the points on the MSD. So those need to be hooked up, and any other sensors you may have, and then your main wiring harness, which runs here. I've already hooked that up over on this side. That's connected to the alternator and the regulator. I have, well, an oxygen sensor I need to hook up down underneath. A few more little things like that, and then it's ready to crank up. All right, moment of truth. Hopefully I have tightened down everything and hooked up all the wires. I have a remote starter button over here. By the way, I don't have the fuel pump on. I'm just trying to pump up some oil through the engine before I try running it. Oil pressure is pegged. I'm gonna have to figure that out. So when I went to crank up my car, the oil pressure gauge was set to full even without the car cranking. So I started looking at the gauge and at the sender, and I found that the sender was set at something like 2,000 ohms, which is bad. This is a newer sender that I know is good, and it reads about 20 ohms at 0 psi. So that I know is a known good sender. The sad part is this sender is a 0 to 10 bar, and it was made in 1965. So this is the original sender that came with this engine. So it's served a pretty good life of, 55 years, 57 years. So I guess it has done very well, but I'm not quite sure what I did when I took the engine out and put it back together. I see there's a small dent in this right here that possibly when I went to crank it back up in there, I dented it or something, but somehow this was working before and now it's not. So I'm going to be replacing with this one, which is dated 8/1991, and it also says it's a 0 to 10 bar, so that is correct. And I know I've had this one in the car before because I had it on a separate engine. So at least I know what's the problem. Tightening this pressure sender down is turning out to be kind of a pain in the butt, so I'm going to use some pliers with duct tape on them to just turn the sensor itself to tighten it on. That seems pretty good. And yeah, getting a 17mm wrench underneath of that thing gave me no space to do it. I didn't want to do a partial engine drop just to get to one nut. So anyway, that should do it.